Hello, my name is Connery Clark, and welcome to my Week 2 assignment of the lynching of African Americans. For this assignment, I'll be answering the questions: how did whites justify lynching? Why did they get away with it? How does Wells appeal to the American conscience, and how does she refute the justifications of lynching? What methods of recourse are recommended by Wells and also by the Cleveland Gazette, and how does intimidation through terror function today? After the abolishment of slavery, lynching emerged and gained popularity among the white majority to establish white supremacy. These lynchings were public acts meant to extinguish black rights and spread fear throughout their communities. Despite Congress passing amendments that gave rights and privileges to African Americans, they turned a blind eye to these acts of violence. More than 4,000 African Americans were lynched across 20 states between the years of 1877 and 1950. Public support for these lynchings were widespread, and people were noticing that no action was taken against the offenders. Lynchings were often advertised in the newspapers in the South. These were brutal acts of violence, and the effects of these lynchings are still felt today. So how were the lynchings justified? When questioned, the people or mobs always blamed it on the victims, saying they were troublesome, they were drawing too much attention to themselves, or they were asking for it, any excuse they could come up with. There was a woman named Mary Turner who was lynched just for speaking out against the lynching of her husband. She was 8 months pregnant at the time she was lynched. They hung her from a tree, threw gasoline on her, and burned off her clothes. Men took a knife and cut into her abdomen while she was still alive. Her baby fell from her body, and a man crushed the baby's head with his foot. They then shot her with hundreds of bullets, ultimately killing her. All of this violence and brutal actions just because she spoke about the killing of her husband. They were lynched for simply speaking to white people and essentially just being African American. It was often justified by saying that the black men raped white women. That was the excuse that they gave, even if it wasn't true. Lynch mobs regularly showed disregard for the legal system, and most often African Americans were lynched without committing any crimes at all. Why did whites get away with lynching? Whites could accuse at will and were rarely punished for their actions against African Americans. Even for those whites who were opposed to lynching, there was not much they could do. If there was an investigation, white citizens closed ranks to protect their own, and rarely were mob leaders identified. As time went on, capital punishment and police became common practice, so lynching declined, and they were now being punished for their crimes, and anti-lynching laws were in place. Wells was born a slave in Mississippi. She was an activist and a journalist who uncovered a lot of information about lynching in the United States. Her research and writing show that many of the reasons given to justify lynching, such as black men raping white women, were false. She spoke of the unwritten law that states certain alleged crimes, no black shall be allowed a trial, and they are not safe from lynching if a woman charges him with assault. Mobs claim that the rape or assault of a white woman by a black man was the reasoning behind these lynchings, when this was not the truth. Whites used this excuse, and it protected them from facing punishment for these lynchings. In most cases, the victims of these lynchings were not charged for their crimes and were found innocent years later. Also, the majority of these relationships between white and blacks were consensual in nature, so there was no truth behind the allegations. This is a poster from the NAACP from 1926. The NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and is the face of activism for civil rights and social justice. This poster is showing awareness of how many people were lynched between 1889 and 1922. They're drawing attention to the fact that people are saying that rape is the cause of lynching, but they're also showing how many women have been lynched in the United States. If there have been that many women who are lynched, how can it be that it's black men raping white women and that's their justification for the lynching? So people are trying to bring awareness to the fact that it's not just rape that is causing the lynchings, that it's really just white supremacy. Lynching most often occurred in the South because they lacked protection of law and order. Wells Barnett sought out a federal anti-lynching law that could convict these mobs and give justice without a trial. She received little support from the White House, but she never stopped drawing attention to the issue and speaking out about it. Many activists continued her campaign in pursuit of a national anti-lynching legislation, and the goal was fully realized in 2020. It took more than a century and would not have been possible without Wells Barnett's efforts. In June of 1901, Cleveland, Ohio passed an anti-lynching law stating the primal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This allowed there to be a law and justice for these cruel acts and started putting a stop to them. This law came about by the persistence and action from one African American's efforts. His fight made this law a reality. Ohio's anti-lynching law served as a model for other states to follow. This, of course, did not stop all lynchings or white-on-black violence, but it put Ohio ahead of others and began the fight to speak up about racial justice and discrimination. The law stated that any individuals assembled for an unlawful purpose, intending to do damage or harm to anyone, and any act of violence exercised by them to the body of any person shall constitute a lynching. White Americans used lynchings to terrorize and show their power over the African Americans. Intimidation through terror is a major tactic used today. Police brutality and killings of blacks are still happening, just not as publicly as lynchings. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan use intimidation, violence, and murder to maintain white supremacy in the South, and to this day remains an active threat against the minority in this country. In the 21st century, blacks are still facing longer jail times for crimes, wage disparities, and discrimination everywhere they turn. In some ways, we have come so far as a nation, abolishing slavery and having anti-lynching laws in place. But until we get the stereotype and stigma out of our head about how different we are, nothing will truly change. These are the 4 references I used. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my assignment.